Hi everyone, Nada here, and today I'm going to check out the latest version of the Aorus 15P gaming laptop from Gigabyte. And unlike the ROG Scar that I reviewed a few weeks back, this one should be on the more affordable side, but then with still some pretty impressive specs. Now, this particular model that I have right here comes with the latest Alder Lake processor from Intel, the i7-12700H, a 130-watt RTX 3070 Ti graphics card, 16 gigs of DDR4 memory, and 165 Hz Quad HD display. But if we look at the website, there are also models with a 3060 or a 3080 Ti with DDR5 memory, and you can even get a faster 360 Hz 1080p display, and you can also mix and match all that depending on your region. So it does sound like a very, very interesting gaming laptop, and I personally really loved the last year's model. So let's see how this one performs and if Gigabyte managed to meet our expectations here. Let's go. This video is brought to you by Corsair and their MP600 Pro LPX SSD. This high-performance Gen 4 SSD offers read speeds of up to 7100 megabytes per second, and it comes with a nice low-profile heatsink, making it a perfect fit for your PlayStation 5 as well as your PC. It is available in several capacities going up to 4 terabytes, and it comes with a comfortable 5-year-long warranty. Check it out using the links in the description below. Now, looking at it, the design hasn't changed much from last year, and that's not a bad decision. It is a decent and sturdy 15-inch laptop that looks pretty neutral, though it does have fairly large exhaust on the back and a small Aorus logo that lights up. It is not too thick, and with a weight of 2.4 kilos, it is definitely a portable gaming laptop and not just a desktop replacement. It is mostly made of plastic, though it looks and feels really well built. It doesn't feel cheap in any way, and you do get a good first impression as soon as you take it out of the box. It easily holds up in that mid-range category it is supposed to be in. You can open it up with one hand, and the hinges are quite small, but I guess they feel sturdy enough, and there is some flex in the panels, but not more than usual. Inside, there is a nicely lit RGB keyboard, pretty typical bezels around the display, and this time around, webcam is up top, so no more giant fingers and nostrils. The keyboard itself feels really nice. It is a pretty standard gaming laptop keyboard, and it took no time to get used to it. It will be comfortable for gaming and for typing with keys that do have a little bit of travel, so they don't really feel flat. I really like that they managed to put a proper numpad into a 15-inch laptop, so if you work with numbers a lot, this will be a very nice feature to have that majority of other 15-inch laptops will not offer. The touchpad is a bit larger than on the last year's model, and it has a nice and smooth surface, which does make it just a little bit nicer to work with. But even though it's above average for a touchpad on a gaming laptop, most people that buy a gaming laptop will use a mouse anyway. But the downside of reusing most of their design from last year is that some of the flaws that I pointed out before are still here. So both the power connector and the Ethernet port are still on the right-hand side, for example, along with the Thunderbolt 4 port. And this is the absolute most terrible positioning on a gaming laptop, as it will always be in the way of your mouse. I truly wish that they put some of those on the back, which has no ports whatsoever. And on the left side, you do get an HDMI 2.1 port, a 5 gigabit USB Type-C port with DisplayPort support, a combined audio jack, and a 5 gigabit USB Type-A port. And in my opinion, having a single Type-A port on a gaming laptop of this size is just not enough. Most gamers will use at least one for their gaming mouse, leaving no Type-A ports for anything else like a headset, for example. So I would say 2 Type-A ports should be an absolute minimum. But what bothers me the most here is that the connections stick out more than on most other laptops. Both the USB ports and the power connector have this awkward space between the connector and the side of the laptop that gives them a lot of room to move around and a lot of chance to break. I was, for example, consistently conscious about not leaning my hand on the Type A port on the left side so I don't accidentally break it, which can easily happen because the keyboard is very close to the edge. So that is definitely something that they need to look at in the future. What I also found really odd is that this laptop, which comes from the actual retail stock, was shipped without any Gigabyte software at all. And even though it kind of sounds great to have a bloatware-free laptop, you also kind of need the control center software to be able to get the most out of this machine, because without it, the CPU is limited to a much lower power level than it should be. So this retail model didn't have any software on it, and on their website, none of the 2022 Alder Lake laptops had drivers or any kind of software packages available to download either. Now, I did ask Gigabyte directly to send it to me, which they did, and now it's also available to download on the website. But if you bought this laptop when it launched, you got a laptop that was underperforming and you had absolutely nothing to fix that. And even though I'm happy that they managed to kind of sort it really quickly, that is something that just should not happen, in my opinion. Anyway, once we got our hands on the software, it was finally time to look at the performance. And as expected, the i7-12700H performs really well. Gigabyte is tuning their laptops very differently from the Scar 15, which kind of lets the CPU use the maximum amount of power for as long as possible, while Gigabyte here lets the processor boost up to about 115 watts for a couple of seconds, then quickly settles down to 70 watts. And that is when using either the Turbo or the Creator profile, which are the two best profiles for CPU performance. An i9 system with a higher power budget can be a lot faster, but even at 70 watts, this 15P is faster than the best laptops of last year, both from AMD and from Intel. And the same goes for single core performance, where Alder Lake is just unmatched right now. Now, I do think the results would be even better if they had tuned their performance profiles a bit better, because the hardware itself is not getting pushed to the limits. So in Turbo and Creator mode, CPU ended up using around 70 watts of power. Now in Turbo mode, the CPU sits at 62 degrees Celsius with a lot of noise, so I would suggest using the Creator mode instead, which is a lot quieter, but still keeps the CPU at around 70 degrees. And you can see that they could have easily let the CPU draw a bit more power to increase performance before running into thermal issues. Now, the gaming profile is a bit different. It enables Nvidia's dynamic boost, so depending on the workload, it can shift power between the CPU and the GPU, but that also doesn't mean that the CPU will always get the power it needs. So if you're just doing a CPU workload, this mode will not push it past 55 watts, so you should manually swap to Creator or Turbo mode for editing or rendering. Now, the last two profiles here are power saving and meeting, and those do exactly what they sound like. So they cut the power down to make sure that the laptop is super quiet, and to save power, it reduces the brightness and the keyboard backlighting. Now, in either mode, it is impossible to hear if the fans are spinning at all. So those are great for some light office work, for example. But let's move on to the gaming performance, and I am going to start with a 1080p resolution so I can compare it to some older laptops that didn't have Quad HD screens. And it is also relevant for this particular laptop because Gigabyte will be selling these with a 1080p panel as well. And the results are, well, pretty complicated. Now, I wouldn't call them bad, but you kind of would expect that this new model with an Alder Lake CPU and a 3070 Ti will consistently outperform the last year's model that had an 11th gen CPU and a 3070. But in many games, it just doesn't. And that is because Gigabyte decided to remove the mux switch this year, even though they knew it will lower the gaming performance. And then especially on low resolution like 1080p, and especially in games with really high frame rates like Doom Eternal, for example, where laptops with a mux switch just perform way better. On 1440p though, it matters a bit less. In most games, this laptop is able to perform actually pretty close to the Scar 15, which is impressive as the Scar had a higher CPU power budget, as well as more and faster DDR5 memory. Now, there are a couple of games where the gap is still significant, like World War Z or Doom Eternal, but in most AAA titles, the Aorus keeps up nicely. Since this one has a 1440p panel, you really should be gaming on 1440p resolution, and generally, you can expect every game to run well on that. Some newer titles like Dying Light 2 really push the limits of this hardware, but that is where DLSS kind of comes into play. So gaming on the resolution that this laptop has to offer really isn't a problem, but there's also a 1080p 360Hz version that I really don't think you should buy. Very few games will run fast enough to justify 360Hz, plus the lack of a mux switch really hurts the 1080p performance a lot, so it just doesn't make sense. And then after ASUS got so much criticism last year for not using a mux switch, I find it really hard to understand why they made the exact same mistake a year later. It could have been avoided easily. So if you go for this laptop, do make sure that you get the 1440p option, and then not just for that high resolution, it is actually a very nice panel. The color gamut is great, offering full sRGB coverage and 95% P3 gamut coverage, and it comes with a good factory calibration as well. It is ready for a P3 workflow right out of the box, and I would have liked to see an sRGB profile, but it's not like the most competitors offer that, so I'm just gonna let it slide. Now, contrast is okay as well, given that this is an IPS display, and the brightness peaks at 327 nits, which is pretty average. It is enough for most use cases, but it will be a little bit low for working in very bright environments. This laptop is also pretty easy to maintain and to upgrade. It is not too difficult to open it up. The fans are easy to clean, the battery and the memory can be easily replaced. You can upgrade the Wi-Fi chip if the included Wi-Fi 6E module ever becomes old, and you can replace the current SSD or add a second one. And speaking of the SSD, the performance seems completely alright and in line with what you should expect. And even though it has a 99 watt-hour battery, the battery life itself is not that spectacular. I got 3.5 hours in the PCMark 8 productivity benchmark, and in the Netflix test, it ran out after about 5.5 hours, which isn't too bad, but it just feels like it could have gotten a few more hours out of that battery if they optimized it a bit better, as some other laptops with similar specs and similar battery size do last a few hours more. Now, the webcam is a little bit better than last year because it's now in the top bezel instead of the bottom, which avoids that very uncomfortable angle where you're just looking up someone's nose, but the quality is still pretty basic. I would still say it will be good enough for an occasional work or an occasional school meeting. The speakers are enough to get by, but there are plenty of laptops out there that sound better. But Gigabyte here kind of went for a full-sized keyboard instead of using that space for better speakers. So it is understandable that it sounds a little bit echoey, but it would still be loud enough to listen to a YouTube video or two. I personally prefer a larger keyboard and using a good headset for gaming and for listening to music. So overall, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this laptop. I mean, some aspects of it are genuinely good. It feels sturdy, the display is excellent, the thermal performance is good, and again, I just love having a full-sized keyboard on a 15-inch laptop. If this was my first laptop in years, I would be very happy with it. But then there's some obvious mistakes that I just cannot let go, like putting important connections on the right-hand side, like having only one single Type A port, then those connections sticking out way too much, like having profiles that could have been balanced way better, and most of all, removing the mux switch. And it kind of feels that instead of going forward, Gigabyte kind of went backwards this year. So in the end, Gigabyte really needs to make sure that this Aorus 15P is priced very competitively for the specs that they're offering, because if you can live with the downsides that I mentioned today and the price is right, it could be a good buy. But I have to admit that I'm personally I kind of expected a bit more because the last year's model was quite good, and I really hope that they will take this criticism today well and just use it to make a better product in the future. Now that's it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!